All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, let me make a disclaimer that you're not going to see any stunts today. I did not sign up for anything like that, so sorry to disappoint you. So today I'll talk about in defense of commons. So what are commons? Commons are common spaces, right? Because after all, that's the theme today. And I'm going to talk about that issue because this presentation is about a call to arms. There's a sense of urgency that I want us to discuss today, and I approach this issue from my own experience as a teacher, as a university professor, and of course, since I've taught in both La Salle and Ateneo, I don't take sides in UAAP finals, and also as a columnist and policy advisor, and also as a global Filipino. So when later I'll discuss these common spaces that I feel are under threat, I'll discuss it from the perspective of me visiting different countries and experiencing how these common spaces have come under threat in the past few years. So unfortunately, you're going to see some of my own pictures and selfies. So some, again, advanced warnings. Okay. Okay, for me, everything started in the classroom. Not long ago, a few months ago, I'm not going to say in which university, we had very contentious discussions inside my classroom. And you can guess about what. It was just shortly after our own polarizing elections. And it was about a specific policy that has put the Philippines in the global spotlight. So you can guess what that policy is, right? And we're going to avoid having any kind of partisan discussion on that. So it was a very contentious issue, and it became very emotional. Now, I always believe that university is the last refuge for us having reasonable, evidence-based, and mutually respectful conversation. So I ask my students, this is what I learned in UP, professors should not impose their points of view on students. They should share with their students their points of view and allow for their students to feel free to express themselves. So I asked my students, are you in agreement with that specific policy, which has come under criticism by human rights groups and a lot of countries around the world? To my astonishment, almost my classroom was split into three. One third was emotionally against it. I had one student almost in tears saying that this is abhorrent, this is unacceptable in a liberal democracy. And then even more astonishingly, I saw almost one third of the other class in a skeptical sense saying, maybe sometimes you need drastic measures to deal with fundamental threats to rule of law and our sense of basic security. So, suddenly the atmosphere changed. The discussions were very contentious. And then one third of the class, the ones remaining, were just observing the debate and were completely undecided. Now, what I realized in that conversation in the classroom was how important was it, first of all, to have that space, that common space for us to share our points of view without the fear of coming under attack, whether physically or psychologically by the other side. I also realized how important it was for someone to be like a night watchman and make sure people don't go WWE or UFC on each other, right? That was a very important thing. So protection of common spaces is extremely important. And that's one thing that we hold sacred within the four corners of the classroom. But that's not only the common space that we should be concerned about. We should also be concerned about common spaces beyond the four corners of the classroom. And I'm going to talk about two S today, S squared, right? Not Samsung or anything like that. One is social media, and the other one is, as you can guess, South China Sea, right? These are two important common spaces that have come under unprecedented assault in the past few years, and that will have implication for each and every one of you, especially for those who use Facebook, which is practically everyone, and those who travel around the region, which is probably most of us, right? Now, so I'll approach this issue from a global Filipino point of view, not so much in the context of the Philippines, but the global point of view. And just to tell you, I'm not going to boast that I'm a jet setter, but I've been in 7 countries already since the start of this year, right? And because it's part of my advocacy to understand these threats that we're facing to these common spaces. So the first thing we want to discuss is new media, or social media, or anti-social media, or psychopath media, whatever you want to call it, as commons. But what are commons? So commons are common spaces. In economics, it's called public goods, right? And public goods or common spaces or commons have two key characteristics. One is they should be non-rivalrous, and second, non-exclusionary, right? It's like air, right? Me breathing the air should not come at the expense of you having access to that air. And it should be non-exclusionary. If you are prevented from breathing, that's the end of your life, right? The same concept applies to, for instance, EDSA, right? EDSA it's supposed to be a common. that allow everyone to pass through, of course, but we can clearly see it's no longer that common because it's getting more and more congested every day. But nonetheless, let's talk about social media. Social media is extremely important because the way it was presented, by the way, I didn't join Facebook until 2013 and 14 because many people thought it was kind of weird if you're not on Facebook, you're doing something fishy. So when I was meeting people in bars and everywhere, you don't have a Facebook? So I had to sign up for Facebook just to be a normal person, right? But I was very skeptical of Facebook. I thought it's a distraction, it's a waste of time. But a lot of people, back in the days, 2012, 13, were saying, this is a new platform for social mobilization. This is an opportunity for us to challenge authority and the establishment. This allows ordinary citizens to circumvent the existing gatekeepers, right? Which is mainstream media, right? Which is politicians. This provides new opportunities for consumers and suppliers to interact, for politicians and statesmen to know about the preferences of their students, right? And let me talk about social media as a reverse fairy tale, right? So a normal fairy tale starts with, you know, it's Snow White, whatever, everything is ugly, and in the end, the prince comes and saves her. In the case of social media, from my own experience and my own academic work, it was a reverse. And let me talk about that, how is it reversed? Now, I think some of you remember there was something called Arab Spring, right? Or Arab Uprising. And it started with self-immolation of a person in Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi. And the next thing you know, by December 2010, one dictator in Tunisia was gone. And then over the next few years, one after the other dictators faced either threats or were overthrown. Now, I happen to be in Egypt. I'll show you my own pictures and selfie. Don't worry about it. I'm sure you're very excited about that. That picture, essentially the guy in Arabic is saying shukran, which you know what it means, right? Thank you. And I think it's Shabab al-Mesr, which means youth of Egypt. So he was essentially thanking Facebook and the youth of Egypt who used the Facebook to mobilize people in the so-called Tahrir Square. No, it's not so-called, it's Tahrir Square, as a reason for them to get rid of their dictator, Mr. Mubarak, right? This was the euphoria. To use the beautiful, to use the rich adjective of Donald Trump, those were beautiful, beautiful days, right? In fact, shortly after, Wael Ghonim, a Google executive, wrote a book called Revolution 2.0, whereby he argued that thanks to social media, now we can hold our leaders accountable like never before. It was a very ambitious treatise by a non-social scientist and a Google executive. And this was huge, And this made actually people like Mark Zuckerberg, among others, look like revolutionaries. People who brought freedom to the last vestige of autocracy, which is the Middle East. Now, incidentally, a few months before the Arab Spring, I was there in Tahrir Square, but for a different engagement. And as you can see, that Totoy lad, that's on 6th October Bridge. Bridge just next to Tahrir Square, and a lot of nasty confrontation between the protesters and the security forces happened during the Egyptian Revolution in early 2011. So these things were very close to my heart, and I visited the Middle East consistently over the years to cover the Arab Spring, and eventually I wrote a book on that. And there's the book. This is not a promotion. But in the subtitle, I talk about the precarious future of the Middle East uprisings. I was skeptical. I was skeptical about where this is going. And I was writing that book in 2012, 2013, before the situation really got bad. And one of the things that I noticed was this euphoria about social media was always questionable. There are a number of reasons why I had doubts about social media. First and foremost, the problem with social media is that it engenders a sense of shallow solidarity, right? Okay, so some poor people in Africa like, right? Some person fighting for her daughter to have a new birthday gift like, right? So that like culture doesn't engender the thick solidarity that you need for revolution. Look at all major revolutions, French Revolution, Chinese Revolution, Iranian Revolution. All these major revolutions had people risking their life and their limb, going there on the street every single day. Now, if you followed the Korean protest against Park Geun-hye, you could see million people going into dark cold to call for the resignation of the president, and eventually it worked. That is what you call true social mobilization. The problem with social media mobilization is that most of us end up just ranting on the Facebook, liking or disliking, or now putting angry or whatever different kinds of emoticon, and that's it. Next, move to the next issue. So this short attention span revolutionary rant is not going to work. So the problem in Egypt and around the Arab world was that people were so good on Facebook, but on the ground, not much organization. So they were outmaneuvered by people who were doing right organization, like the Muslim Brotherhood, among others. The second problem is, in sophisticated countries, sophisticated autocratic countries, I don't need to name these countries, they're big, they're powerful, they can actually infiltrate and survey what you're doing in your Facebook. In some countries, you have to get all your Facebook or Twitter, whatever, encrypted to make sure no one is watching you. Well, in certain countries, the government could very much see what was happening behind the scenes. And in fact, use the Facebook communication or social media communication of the opposition to track what will be their next activity. In fact, it became this ridiculous. So opposition people say, oh, on February 18, let's have a protest. The government perfectly knows when it's going to happen, so they're going to prepare and close off the entire area. So at some point, it was now working in the reverse. The third problem, and this is where it got a little bit uglier, was that social media became a platform for polarization. So if you're anti an issue, you have your own Facebook page, and if you're pro an issue, you make your own Facebook page, and depending on your emotional stance, you just visit one side and never listen to the other side. So complete polarization, right? In the Ukraine crisis, for instance, if you're Russian speaking, you have your own sources on social media. If you're Ukrainian speaking, you have your own sources. So there was not much comments happening, not much communication happening. And the fourth one, where things got really ugly, I was not able to cover this in my book because what's happening here? Can we put it next? Okay. Oops, I ruined the surprise. Is Twitter devolution, right? The rise of ISIS was a clear indication that technology is ultimately a double-edged sword. It depends on how you use it. And what we had were a bunch of extremists using Twitter to actually propagate their hate ideology. In fact, to tell you how creative these guys were, I suppose you know about soccer, right? World Cup. Sometimes they use the hashtag of World Cup and name of people like Lionel Messi and then put their own crazy videos there. So essentially, you had extremist groups hijacking these social media avenues to push for their ideology. So at some point, it became toxic, and at some point, the social media actually helped these people to project power beyond what they were. I remember like a year ago or something, like my cousins were asking me, Richard, are these ISIS guys going to take over the world? Because they were watching all these videos on Twitter, on Facebook. So you could see how it worked as a multiplier effect for these groups to project power around the world. Now, things got even nastier last year with the advent of so-called fake news, right? Now, if you can see in that picture, oops. Okay. It's a picture that claims, based on a fake news site, that the Syrian refugee renounced Islam after tasting bacon, right? So it's essentially saying that, you know, it's all about tasting bacon and that's where you're going to give up your faith. So now this is a much more trivial fake news, and it got actually nastier over time. So you can see the top 5 fake election stories in 2016. The first one said that actually Pope Francis endorsed Donald Trump for president. Sounds familiar, right? And then, of course, so on and so forth. And the situation is actually much more worrying. So there was a study done by a Stanford University and New York University academic about the election last year in the United States that showed that fake news came to dominate the public space. So as far as social media is concerned, people were not minding CNNs and BBCs and the Bloombergs of this world. Everyone was minding fake news. This was huge. So can you imagine a situation whereby people are relying more on social media, but is now a poison well of fake news? And that really worked against one candidate and very much in favor of the other candidate. You can guess who we are talking about. Now, this is another interesting figure that shows that at some point, people were relying more on fake news than mainstream news. And the thing with fake news, unlike mainstream news, is that mainstream news is supposed to be objective, right? So it's written in a very bland way. It doesn't inspire emotion. Fake news, on the other hand, is systematically arranged to provoke emotion. And in elections nowadays, apparently for the best way to predict an electoral outcome is not the surveys anymore. In fact, our Pulse Asia and SWS was more accurate than the US election pollsters. The best way now to gauge how the election could turn out based on a study done by a South African firm is emoticons, emotions, right? Like Do you know that? Like, there's a picture of this person and you see a lot of hearts, right? So one candidate in the US was very successful, had half of the screen all hearts, half of the screen all like hatred, anger, right? The other candidate was essentially nothing. No one cared. And guess who won? So social media now appeals to our emotions. It's much more personal. It's less bland. So if you can poison that well for a specific agenda, you can actually decide the electoral outcome, right? And from Brexit to Donald Trump and to elections this year, French elections, we can see that this situation is getting more and more serious to the point that both Barack Obama, Angela Merkel, a lot of global leaders are not talking about fake news as a threat to democracy. Now, incidentally, I was there in the Times Square during the US election before I gave a talk at Columbia University, and this is the snapshot I took when I felt it's over. Donald Trump is going to win this election. In fact, I called it live on different channels. I actually uploaded a live shot of the election coverage on my Facebook account. And by this number, around 46, 47%, I knew that Hillary Clinton lost it. Of course, where's the next one? Okay, that's me. Okay, let's just move forward. Just an evidence that I was there. Okay, what is the relevance to us here in the Philippines? Why should we care? Right? I'm talking about other countries. I'm talking about the Arab world. I'm talking about United States. What is the relevance to us? Now, I came across a very interesting data about what are countries around the world most known for. Please ignore UAE and Pakistan. All right. Look at the Philippines. What are we known for as our best thing, right? Social networking. I really don't know what they mean. But I think what it clearly says is that a lot of us depend on social media a lot. Now, of course, the other thing that is under threat nowadays is the South China Sea. And you could see that the situation is getting uglier and uglier with greater militarization of these disputes. Now, why should we care about that? Because just like social media is also a common space. Have you visited other countries in the ASEAN? If you have noticed, you pass over a body of water, right? That's called the South China Sea. And if that body of water is militarized, your safety, your ability to pass through safely through that area comes under question. Not to mention our access to trillions of dollars of trade every year, our access to energy resources that we import from other countries, not to mention fishery resources. 70 to 80% of our resources, fishery stock, comes from the South China Sea. Now, over the years, of course, as part of my advocacy, I tried to join different initiatives, including this one with previous President of Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou, on pushing for a South China Sea peace initiative. And eventually, I consolidated all of my advocacies and analysis into my previous book, Asia's New Battlefield. Now, to wrap it up, there are solutions. And I think this is not a problem that is hopeless. As Thomas Jefferson put it, you know, the price for liberty is eternal vigilance. And I think it's the same level of vigilance that we should have when it comes to social media, when it comes to pushing for peace in the South China Sea. And just like in my classroom, I realized that not only should we guard these common spaces to make sure they're not poison wells, we also have to guard our own biases, our emotions and anger to make sure that we don't deprive others their capability and their ability to have mutual respectful and evidence-based discussion with each other.